Welcome to another segment of our interview series, Perspectives of a Professional. In this segment, Scott will discuss the substance abuse assessment itself, the tools he uses, and the clinical impressions he gains from these assessments.
So we've talked a lot about kind of the reasons why, SAP assessments are important and what, employers can do to utilize these services. What does an SAP assessment actually consist of? Like, what happens during that process?
So a SAP assessment. So it's good to clarify too. SAPs, qualified SAPs are not physicians and not psychologists with APE certification. So we can't diagnose.
Okay.
But what we can give employers is a clinical impression, and a clinical impression of whether the employee meets criteria for substance use disorder or not.
Okay.
And to what degree, mild, moderate, severe, and provide a framework for most appropriate recommendations to be able to return to work safely. So in a SAP assessment, basically it's a minimum of 2 hours comprehensive assessment combined with using a variety of addiction screening tools. Some of those would include, the MAST, the DAS, the QDID-R, the ADS, the SASI-4, DSM-5 checklist, the CAGE. So, there's about 12 of them that we might choose from depending on the situation. So for employers who are thinking, is this just a hunch? There's more to it than that, right? There is some evidence-based validity as well. And combining with an interview where we're going to get lots of history in areas of, not just substance use, but also, family of origin, work history, school history, legal history, mental health and medication history, previous interventions or workplace issues, that kind of thing. So kind of combining everything together and coming up of one impression, and then making the most appropriate recommendations going forward to ensure people get the right support and can return to work safely.
Awesome. A question that I always get, it comes up always when I'm delivering workplace training is, could a worker or could an individual cheat their test? So I get that question a lot of, hey, if people understand human rights legislation and they know that an addicted worker has to be accommodated, could they lie on their screening tools or could they lie to you to obtain an addiction diagnosis or a clinical impression of addiction?
Yeah, so that's a very good point, and some people I'm sure attempt to do that. So and it's good to note that it's not an exact science, right? So people are human, people are going to lie, people are going to deny, people are going to minimize. What I would say to that is that that's where the experience in these areas really comes into play. There are, in the screening tools, there are measures for defensiveness and things like that. So there are ways of finding out whether someone's really being defensive or maybe being a little mischievous in their answers.
Okay.
Yeah, so it's not an exact science, but I can tell you 100% you're going to get a much better impression and a much general better sense for what's going on than trying to get this from some other potential avenues.
Awesome. And so, obviously with COVID, it has made doing things in person and direct a lot more challenging. So do you offer assessments in a virtual format, and does that change the effectiveness of the assessment?
Well, yes and no. Like in the back of my mind, I'm trying to hear the voice of my mentor, and she'd be like, yeah, in person is always the best way to go. You can look people up and you can smell the things coming off them and kind of pay attention to the and there is a key to that. There is a part to that. But I would also say that if people are going to try to be defensive and, minimize or deny or even lie to you, they're going to do it in person the same way they do it virtually, right? So
Absolutely.
yeah, so I just know, DOT is supposed to be in person too, has to be in person, except with COVID. Obviously, they have to make adjustments. So seeing people virtually is better than not seeing people at all.
Absolutely.
And to be honest, with some of the barriers in travel, there's not a lot of people with these kind of qualifications. So it's much much more satisfying for the employer to get somebody qualified to do these things virtually rather than not getting them done at all. So
Absolutely. I know for us, for Shift as a service provider, we service clients nationwide. And one of the things that our clients enjoy about the virtual avenue is that all of their assessments are done consistently. So they're all done by the same SAP. They get the same report. But I don't know, from my perspective, I think we've been really appreciative of the virtual format that you've been offering.
well, thanks. That's always good to hear. Yeah, I'm not a tech wizard either, right? But we work through it and try to make it as feasible for people and as comfortable and less painless as possible, right? So try to have some fun while we're doing it as well. So
absolutely. And I think this is,
glad to hear.
kind of the writings on the wall. This is what we're seeing in the medicine field, right? We're seeing a lot of telemedicine and, new utilizations of technology. So I think this is something we can expect to see going forward. I'm kind of waiting to see what DOT is going to do later on, whether or not they're going to continue to allow virtual assessments, once COVID has relaxed a bit more, or whether they're going to go back to the old way of it has to be done in person for DOT specifically.
Yeah, I guess it'd be interesting to see if some of the stuff sticks long term. So
Absolutely. Absolutely. So in terms of the information that the employer is going to get after the assessment process, what kind of information can they expect and how will that benefit them moving forward?
yeah, so basically they're going to get a clinical impression whether someone meets criteria for substance use disorder or not.
Okay.
And right off the bat, that can help kind of guide how their policy goes and what accommodation they provide or not, or discipline or support, right? So, and then depending on what level, if someone meets criteria and what level of risk they would have, we would match people with the appropriate resources to ensure that they can either get healthy or return to work in a safe fashion so they can be compliant with their policies. So
awesome. Yeah, and I've noticed, through looking at some of the reports that are generated and things like that, that you are very good at providing options for the employee and for the employer, so that they can move forward in a way that works for them. So, you'll always provide like a public option and maybe a private option where treatment is recommended so that the employee can, figure out for themselves, whether they have the money to maybe go to a private option where they can get in quicker, or whether they're going to be going to a public option where it may take a little bit longer to get accepted into treatment, but it would be a little bit less expensive and maybe work better within their budget.
yeah, and what I've heard from employers too is that so they're getting more information that they can use, options that can help them determine what steps to go forward legally. So for employers that might be interested in illustrating due process or due diligence, right, and making sure they do things according to labor laws, they found that very helpful. Another thing to mention too is that when we talk about this area, people think about addiction and people being substance use dependent. That's the only people that are needing these services, right? But to keep in mind that roughly about 80% or 85% of all the referrals we get, from yourselves or from other providers, though 85% of those folks do not meet criteria for substance use disorder. So thinking of things, catching things early, situations that, opportunities that arise that the employer can intervene and kind of nip things in the bud. A lot of times people might just need some safety sensitive education. Folks could be, maybe just immature, weren't really thinking about their policy, abusing substances, but not dependent, poor decision making, all of the above. So the folks get some quick resources to be able to make better choices in the future, more clearly separate substance use from the workplace and be compliant and safe at work. So
awesome.